There's a silent, almost invisible moment when something inside you senses you're holding on too tightly. It's not a dramatic event. It's not a tragedy. It's a subtle psychological discomfort that appears when everything seems normal, but inside, something doesn't fit. You wake up, go about your routines, answer messages, plan for the future, and yet you feel a weight that's hard to name, as if life were passing you by, and you were trying to slow it down with your bare hands. Perhaps you've already felt this when you realized a good phase was starting to change, or when something you believed to be stable began to waver. Relationships, identities, certainties, dreams. There's an internal conflict there, almost unconscious. The mind wants permanence, control, predictability, but reality insists on moving. And it is in this silent clash that much of human suffering is born. Not the obvious suffering, but the constant psychological suffering that drains energy and meaning. Because, deep down, there's a question we rarely face, honestly. If everything you love is going to change, why do you keep living as if it were permanent? This question isn't comfortable. It shakes internal structures, the way you cling, plan, and define yourself. It touches on the fear of loss, impermanence, and lack of control. And precisely for that reason, it's almost always avoided. We prefer distractions, quick answers, practical explanations that don't require deep awareness. But that question remains, echoing. It appears when you try to hold on to an old version of yourself, when you resist an end that has already happened internally, when you suffer not exactly because of what has changed, but because of the insistence on maintaining what is no longer. Psychologically, this creates tension. Practically, it generates wear and tear. Consciously, it calls for a more honest look. Philosophically, it reveals something essential about the human experience. There is a silent poetry in this conflict, a minimalist aesthetic of existence that is rarely perceived. Everything is in flux, but the mind wants straight lines. Everything is transient, but the ego seeks solidity. And in this attempt to freeze what is alive, we end up distancing ourselves from life itself, not because it abandons us, but because we resist its natural movement. Perhaps you've never stopped to observe this carefully, not intellectually, but experientially, like observing your breath, like observing a thought arising and fading. The discomfort doesn't come from the change itself. It arises from the friction between what is and what you would like it to be. This is a profoundly psychological dynamic, but also a practical one. It affects your decisions, your relationships, your mental health, your ability to be present. And the more you try to control, the more tired you become. The more you try to ensure that nothing changes, the more anxious you become. There's something almost paradoxical here. The search for security can become the greatest source of internal instability. The mind fights, the body feels, and consciousness observes, if you allow it. Because there comes a point where resistance ceases to be protection and becomes imprisonment. Perhaps that's why certain ancient traditions didn't begin by teaching how to conquer, accumulate, or win, but how to observe, let go, and understand. Not as an escape from reality, but as a more lucid immersion in it. There is a wisdom that doesn't shout, doesn't promise shortcuts, doesn't offer magical solutions. It simply points to something simple and profoundly challenging. Everything changes, and when that truth begins to be truly felt, not just understood, something inside you also begins to move, not chaotically, but consciously, as if an inner door were about to be opened. It is here that the initial conflict ceases to be mere discomfort and transforms into an invitation to look at life without trying to hold on to it tightly, to perceive where you are living and where you are merely resisting. And it is precisely from this point that an ancient wisdom begins to make sense, not as distant philosophy, but as a practical tool for navigating human experience with greater clarity, presence, and freedom. And before we move on to that deeper understanding, there's something essential that needs to happen now. Not at the end of the video, not later, but at this very moment. Because transformation doesn't begin just by listening. It begins when you consciously engage with what is being said. If this reflection has already triggered some psychological discomfort in you, if at some point you recognized yourself resisting change, that's no coincidence. This discomfort is a sign of emerging awareness. And the simplest, most practical, and most powerful way to transform this into something alive is to externalize it, to bring it from the internal to the real. Therefore, I want to invite you to do something different from the automatic. In the comments, write a single word or short phrase. I am willing to change, or I choose to live, not resist. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but for you. When you write, you make an internal decision visible. Psychologically, this creates commitment. Consciously, this marks a turning point. Philosophically, this is a small act of detachment from inertia. Comments are not just a space for opinion, they are a collective field of intention. When you write, you are not alone. You connect with other people who are also going through this same silent conflict between control and acceptance, between attachment and presence. This exchange creates something rare these days, an aesthetic, human, and conscious space for real reflection. And if this content resonates with you, if it touches on something that goes beyond the surface, a like isn't just a mechanical gesture, it's a sign of alignment, a recognition that this type of approach, psychological, practical, and conscious, needs to continue to exist. By liking, you help this video reach other people who may be experiencing the exact same conflict but haven't yet been able to name it. Subscribing to the channel isn't about quantity, it's about continuity. It's about choosing to journey with content that doesn't accelerate your mind but deepens your perception. Content that doesn't deliver ready-made answers but creates inner space. Here, each video is an invitation to observation, to silence, to lucidity. And staying is a conscious choice, because everything we're talking about isn't distant theory, it's lived experience. And the next step in this reflection begins when you allow this simple truth, that nothing remains, to be not only understood, but felt. It is from there that wisdom ceases to be a concept and begins to become practice. When Buddhism speaks of impermanence, it's not trying to make you pessimistic, cold, or detached from life. On the contrary, it's pointing to something extremely psychological, practical, and conscious, something you already experience every day, even without realizing it. Impermanence, called anicca, is not an abstract concept. It's the most honest description of reality. Everything that exists is in constant motion, even when it seems still, even when the mind insists on calling it stable. Observe calmly. Everything is born, changes, and disappears. Thoughts arise from nowhere and vanish without asking permission. Emotions appear with force, dominating the body, the breath, the mood, and then dissolve. The pain that seemed unbearable at some point in your life is now just a distant memory. The joy you swore would last forever has also changed form. Nothing failed in this. Nothing went wrong. This is life working exactly as it is. The problem begins when the mind creates resistance, when it transforms what is transient into identity, when you start saying, I am anxious, I am sad, I am like this. Buddhism invites a more refined, almost poetic perspective. You are not what you feel now. You are the space where it appears and disappears. This difference seems subtle, but psychologically it changes everything. Because when you identify with what is fleeting, you begin to fight against the very nature of experience. And this struggle is silent. It happens on an internal level, conscious and unconscious. You try to prolong good moments as if you could freeze them. You try to avoid difficult moments as if you could erase them. You live between the fear of losing and the anxiety of keeping, and the more you try to control, the more rigid you become. The body tenses. The mind races. Presence is lost. It is here that suffering begins to take shape, not as a one-off event, but as a continuous state of resistance. There's a phrase that sums it up with almost surgical precision. Suffering begins when we try to freeze what was born to flow. It's not the change that hurts. It's the attempt to prevent it from happening. It's wanting the emotion to stay, the person to stay, the phase to stay, even yourself to remain the same. But nothing was made to stay. Everything was made to transform. And when this truth is understood not only intellectually, but felt in the body and consciousness, something begins to relax. Impermanence, in this sense, is not loss. It is freedom. Because if everything changes, then nothing defines you forever. No mistake, no pain, no emotional state has the power to imprison you eternally. This is profoundly therapeutic, even though Buddhism never used that word. There is a silent mental health in this understanding, an aesthetic of existence based on lightness, observation, and acceptance. When you begin to realize that emotions are temporary events, you stop fighting them and start listening to them. When you understand that phases pass, you go through them with more presence. When you accept that life is not fixed, you stop demanding impossible guarantees from it. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you conscious, attentive, truly living in the now without carrying the weight of trying to hold on to what is already changing. Perhaps you were never taught to look at life this way. Perhaps you learned to control, plan, predict, protect yourself. But there is another kind of wisdom, quieter, more minimalist, that doesn't seek to dominate experience, only to understand it. And that's exactly where Buddhism becomes practical. Not as a distant religion, but as a lens to understand human psychology with more clarity and less internal conflict. As you listen to this, notice what's happening inside you. Don't force answers, just observe. Does any resistance arise? Any relief? Any identification? This observation is already conscious practice. It's already the beginning of something different. And if at any point in this reflection, something made sense, write it down. In the end, when you feel the time is right, write simple phrases in the comments like, "I understand impermanence," "I am learning to let go," or even just the word "anicca." This seemingly small gesture creates presence, commitment, and connection. And it is from there that this understanding begins to deepen even further in the next step of the reflection. At some point in life, almost without realizing it, you begin to confuse living with resisting. On the outside, everything seems to be going normally. You continue functioning, fulfilling roles, making decisions. But inside, there's a constant tension, a psychological exhaustion that doesn't come exactly from what is happening, but rather from how you relate to what is happening. This is where suffering begins to form, not as a sudden impact, but as a silent accumulation of small internal struggles. Pain, contrary to what we've been taught, doesn't stem from change itself. It stems from resistance to change, from the refusal to accept that something has ended, from the insistence on maintaining a version of life that has already begun to unravel. Psychologically, resistance seems like protection. It seems like strength. It seems like control. But in practice, this resistance creates constant friction between reality and expectations, and all prolonged friction generates emotional, mental, and even physical exhaustion. Think about how many times you resisted the end of a relationship, not just the external end, but the internal end, that moment when something had already changed inside, but you kept insisting, trying to fix it, explain it, revive what no longer existed in the same way. The pain didn't just come from losing the person, but from fighting against the fact that that story was already transforming. Resisting the end was more painful than going through the end. The same thing happens when you resist a difficult phase in life. Instead of going through it with presence, you enter into conflict with it. You question why this is happening, compare it to other phases, create mental narratives of injustice or failure. The mind goes into opposition to the experience. And the more you fight against the moment, the more trapped you become in it. The phase passes, but the resistance leaves marks. The body holds tension. The mind holds fear. Consciousness shuts down. There is also an even more subtle, deeper, and less perceived resistance. Resisting who you are becoming. Resisting internal changes, new perceptions, the parts of yourself that no longer fit the old persona. Many people suffer not because they are lost, but because they are changing, and they try to prevent it. They try to remain who they were to please others, to feel safe, to avoid facing the emptiness that comes before the new person takes shape. This constant resistance creates a psychological state of alert. You live as if you are always defending yourself from something, defending yourself from pain, from the end, from the unknown, from impermanence. But this defense comes at a high price. You cease to be present. You stop living the moment as it is. You live anticipating, comparing, trying to adjust reality to what it should be. And it is at this point that the question that runs through all of this arises. A simple but profoundly uncomfortable question that deserves a real pause to be felt, not just heard. Are you living the moment or fighting against it? This question acts like a mirror. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't judge, it doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply reflects. Because if you observe honestly, you'll realize how many times you're resisting without noticing. Resistance to silence, resistance to boredom, resistance to pain, resistance to joy that seems too unstable to be trusted, resistance to life exactly as it presents itself now. Buddhism doesn't call this a moral error, nor a weakness. It calls it ignorance, in the most neutral sense of the word, not seeing reality as it is. And when you don't see it, you struggle. When you struggle, you suffer. This suffering is not punishment. It's a natural consequence of trying to swim against the current all the time. The water isn't against you. It's simply flowing. There is something profoundly liberating when you begin to perceive this dynamic. Not to blame yourself, but to observe yourself. To notice where you harden, where you close yourself off, where you create internal war. This level of observation is already awareness. It is already practice. It is already a movement to get out of psychological autopilot and come into direct contact with the raw, changeable, impermanent human experience. As you listen to this, perhaps some specific situations have come to mind. Maybe a relationship, a phase, a version of yourself. Don't push it away. Just acknowledge it. This acknowledgement is the beginning of real change, not forced change, but the kind that happens when you stop resisting what's already happening. And if at any point in this reflection you identified with it, hold on to that for a few more seconds. At the end, when you feel it makes sense, write something simple in the comments like, "I recognize my resistance. I'm learning to live in the moment," or just the word living. This gesture helps bring to consciousness what was previously diffuse and prepares the ground for the next step in this understanding we are building together. There is a very delicate and profoundly liberating point that few people clearly grasp. The moment when acceptance ceases to feel like giving up and begins to be experienced as freedom. The mind, conditioned to control, often confuses acceptance with weakness, as if letting go were synonymous with losing, as if allowing were the same as abandoning. But conscious wisdom points to the exact opposite. Letting go is not giving up on life. It is giving up the internal war against it. When you accept impermanence, something subtle happens on a psychological level. Tension begins to decrease. The body no longer needs to defend itself all the time. The mind slows down because it is no longer trying to predict, correct, or hold on to every detail of the experience. Accepting doesn't mean liking what happens. It means stopping wasting energy trying to prevent reality from being what it already is. And this saving of energy changes everything. Letting go of expectations is one of the most difficult and transformative acts there is. Expectations seem harmless, even positive, but often they are just silent contracts with the future. You expect people to act in a certain way, for life to respond in a certain manner, for you yourself to always be consistent with a projected image. When these expectations are not met, and they almost never are, frustration, resentment, and a sense of injustice arise. Not because something went wrong, but because reality didn't sign the agreement that the mind created on its own. By letting go of expectations, you don't become indifferent. You become present. You begin to relate to what is happening now, not to what should be happening. This is extremely practical in daily life and profoundly healthy from the point of view of conscious mental health. You begin to listen more, react less, observe more clearly. Life ceases to be a battlefield and begins to resemble more of a flow to be traversed. Observing without attachment is another essential movement on this path. Attachment is not love. Attachment is trying to possess, define, fix. Love observes. Attachment controls. When you observe without attachment, you allow thoughts to arise and disappear without transforming them into identity. You perceive intense emotions without getting lost in them. You feel pain without being reduced to it. This doesn't distance you from the human experience, it brings you closer to it with greater clarity. There's a silent aesthetic to this kind of observation, a minimalist beauty in being present without demanding that the moment be different. It's like sitting on the bank of a river and watching the water flow by, instead of going against the current trying to change its direction. Awareness expands when you stop compulsively interfering. And in that expanded space, something within you begins to breathe. Allowing life to move forward is perhaps the most radical act of trust that exists. Not a naive trust, but a conscious trust, built through direct observation of impermanence. You realize that everything moves independently of your resistance. That change doesn't ask permission. And then the choice arises: to suffer trying to stop it, or to live learning how to navigate it. When you stop resisting, life begins to breathe through you. This phrase isn't poetic by chance. It describes a real experience. The body relaxes, the mind creates space, consciousness expands. You continue to feel, continue to engage, continue to live, but without the constant burden of trying to guarantee results. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you available. Available to respond instead of react, to act without rigidity, to change without losing yourself. Acceptance doesn't happen all at once. It's a silent, daily, almost invisible practice. With each small letting go, something organizes itself inside. With each abandoned expectation, lightness emerges. With each observation without judgment, clarity is born. And this process doesn't distance you from practical life. It returns you to it in a more whole, more conscious, more human way. As you listen to this, perhaps something within you is already relaxing, even if only slightly. Perhaps a situation comes to mind, an expectation, an attachment, an old resistance. It doesn't need to be resolved now. Simply noticing it is already part of the journey. And if it makes sense to you, at the end, leave a comment with simple words like, "I'm learning to let go," "I choose to accept," or simply, "allow." This small gesture helps transform understanding into presence and prepares the ground for the next step in this inner journey we are undertaking together. Perhaps now, you can already sense that this reflection isn't just about understanding something new, but about inhabiting life in a different way. Because the big turning point doesn't happen when you discover that everything changes. You've always known that, on some level. The turning point happens when this truth ceases to be merely philosophical and begins to permeate your daily choices, your way of thinking, feeling, and relating to the world. The question then shifts. It stops being, "Why is this changing?" and becomes something much deeper, much more psychological and conscious. How do I choose to live, knowing that everything changes? This question doesn't require haste. It demands presence. It doesn't want a pretty answer, nor a definitive conclusion. It wants sincerity, because living with the awareness of impermanence changes your inner rhythm. You begin to realize that you don't need to rush so much, nor cling so tightly. You begin to realize that many of your anxieties don't come from what's happening, but from the constant attempt to ensure that nothing escapes your control. And when that attempt falters, something silent opens up. To live knowing that everything changes is to learn to be fully present in the now, without demanding that the present last longer than it can. It is to feel joy without anxiety about the end. It is to go through pain without despair at the beginning. It is to understand that each experience has its own time, its own function, its own ending. Psychologically, this generates emotional maturity. Consciously, this creates inner space. Philosophically, this aligns you with the very nature of life. There is a new way of living that arises from this understanding. A less rigid, less defensive, less fear-based way. You begin to listen more and react less. You begin to observe your thoughts as movements, not as absolute truths. You begin to feel your emotions as waves, not as definitions of who you are. This doesn't distance you from the intensity of life. On the contrary, it brings you back to it with more presence and less unnecessary suffering. This new way of living doesn't promise the absence of pain. It promises less resistance to pain, and that completely changes the experience. Because when you stop fighting the inevitable, the energy previously spent on conflict begins to transform into clarity. You start to choose your battles better, to let go of what doesn't depend on you, to take care of what is still alive instead of trying to resurrect what has already completed its cycle. Nothing remains, not emotional states, not phases, not past versions of yourself. And this is not a threat, it's an invitation not to get lost trying to hold on to what is already leaving, an invitation not to define yourself by what is in transition, an invitation to live more lightly, even amidst the complexity of the human experience. When you truly accept this, something curious happens. You begin to value the present more, not out of fear of losing it, but out of awareness of its fleeting nature. You listen more attentively, you love more honestly, you live more fully, not because everything will end, but because everything is happening now. And now is the only place where life truly exists. This reflection doesn't aim to convince you of anything. It wants to walk with you for a few moments. It wants to create an inner space where you can breathe, question, observe, an aesthetic, silent, conscious space where the mind doesn't need immediate answers. Because some understandings don't arrive as conclusions. They arrive as maturation. Perhaps as you listen to this, something within you is rearranging priorities. Perhaps old urgencies are beginning to lose their power. Perhaps new questions are arising. Don't rush this process. Let it happen in its own time, just as everything in life happens. This is the simplest and most difficult practice at the same time, allowing. And if this reflection resonated with you, if at any point you felt that these words touched something real, stay here. Not as an obligation, but as a conscious choice. This space is for those who want to look at life with more depth, more silence, more truth. For those who understand that self-knowledge is not about accumulating answers, but about learning to ask better questions. Finally, if you feel like it, leave a message in the comments. Something simple but honest. You can write, "I choose to live," or "I will not resist," or simply, "present." Some people prefer to write, "I accept," others, "I am learning." The form doesn't matter. What matters is the intention. This gesture helps to anchor reflection in the concrete, to transform listening into presence, thought into shared awareness. And from here, without haste, without promises, without formulas, we move on to the next step of this inner journey. Because understanding that nothing remains is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of a more lucid, lighter, and truer way of being alive.